Hello and welcome to Minor Compositions. Today we're joined by Paul Rekret. I hope I got your name moderately in the
That's right.
neighborhood. To have a chat about his, I was going to say new, but it's a year old, so it seems a bit weird saying new, but in academic terms, that's still new, right?
Yeah, it's a 1 year anniversary just passed, I
Uh,
think. But yeah,
he, he,
hot off the
he's
press.
very proud of his adorable baby book, Take This Hammer, Work Solving Crisis, which is a lot of fun. Well, maybe fun's the wrong word. It's a very good book. Um, um, and so we're gonna have a chat about that. So thanks for coming along, Paul.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So maybe as a point to kick off, it's always kind of dangerous to go for a sort of big picture question or try to like summarize a book into a pithy line. But one of the things I really like about your book is the way you explore that when you listen to music, when you listen to songs, they always bear traces of the context they come from. I don't mean in sort of like a quite easy kind of like, sign of the times way, but they bear traces of the contradictions they were in, the struggles they were in, deep traces. In a way, you can almost say like, when Marx talks about the thing about the commodities is yet to go into the hidden abode of production. I think a lot of what you're doing here is almost like going into the hidden social abode of musical production and trying to trace out the sort of like these sort of deeper sense of context, not just in terms of like it was a place, but more of like what was going on there, what were the conflicts, what were the tensions. Is that a fair rendering?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really generous way of articulating what I'm trying to do. I mean, the way I kind of articulate this is to say that what I'm interested in is the relationship of political economy and cultural form. Um, and I think that to be a bit sort of catty, I think in contemporary cultural studies and in a lot of contemporary popular music studies in particular, you kind of get one or the other. That is to say, you either get people doing a sociology of music and talking about the context without really trying to think through what that thing is doing aesthetically, what makes it work or not work in some cases, what gives it its power, its affective sort of charge, or on the other hand, sort of narrowly isolating the aesthetic properties of the cultural object, right? So what I'm trying to do, and my sort of aim is partly to constantly be moving between the two. And the way that I do that, or the way that I sort of resolve that, or try and not resolve, but the way I try and sort of articulate the relationship between those two things is work, labor, right? So, on the one hand, music produced in a capitalist society is produced through labor, usually, often in various ways. I mean, it's circulation, it's distribution. In some cases, music making is also wage labor. People consuming that music, listening to that music, have to survive or compelled to survive by working for a wage. Um, and lastly, I guess the other kind of element in this kind of triad I'm painting here is that the music itself is a rejection of wage labor and a refusal of wage labor, if you like. And by that, I simply mean that generally, historically, music was opposed to work. The institution of popular music as it emerges in the 20th century emerges as the thing you do when you get off work, the thing you do in the evening, the thing you do in the weekend, whether it's listening to music or playing in a band or whatever it is. And that speaks to the fact that actually, because work sucks, work is monotonous, it's repressive, it's an activity that's disciplined down to its most sort of minute actions and activities, and is has no room for expression whatsoever or expressivity whatsoever. And so music can become a kind of container in a way for this the hatred of work, right? Or the refusal of work.
Mm.
So by thinking about labor, music as an expression of the refusal of labor, thinking about the labor that produces the music, thinking about the labor that organizes the society in which the music is made and consumed, I think I can more or less smoothly sort of move between all of these levels, right? As if kind of nesting dolls or something like that. So that's the kind of wager, in partly the kind of methodological wager, I guess, or what I'm trying to do with the book, right? Is think about work really broadly in this way.
No, it's super interesting because, for instance, I mean, like, if you go to almost like the kind of like Althusserian idea that in the last instance the economy determines, okay, maybe, but there's a lot of things that happen before the last instance.
Hmm.
There's a lot of ways that relationship isn't necessarily a one-way relationship. I mean, maybe it's the ways in which the cultural form can also prefigure or anticipate the economic form. And there you get someone like Jacques Attali and Noyes talking about composition and the way certain forms of organization that come about in music then almost come before things happen elsewhere in economic relations. Um,
Yeah. Is this a space where we can sort of be a little bit mean to Althusser? I mean, I love Althusser, but for
Can we
me,
be mean to Al? Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
I'm sure. I don't think he's gonna send me or you an angry email anytime soon.
Okay. The Althusser's been very influential for me, but the problem for me is that precisely I mean, how are culture and economy, or the material and the ideal, mediated in Althusser? Ultimately, the link between those two spheres, right, or those two levels, is never mediated at all. Um, and so there's a kind of gap, right? Which I think in some ways a lot of Althusser's students then try and work through, whether that's Badiou, whether that's Rancière, whether that's Laclau, for instance. All of them are kind of, I think, in some way, have a legacy of trying to deal with this tension,
Hmm.
which is the sort of gap between levels of analysis that he never sort of so analytically that thinking in those levels is very useful, but ontologically perhaps I don't know if he ever resolves how they're in fact related ultimately, right? There's a kind of inf indefinite leap between them. And I suppose that one of the ideas that my book sort of works from is that, I mean, that cultural activity is already economic activity, right?
Hmm.
Like I said, I mean, music, whether music making is actually organized along capitalist lines or does in fact constitute wage labor, it's made with technologies that are inevitably going to be developed first for industrial applications in one way or another, or by wage laborers is certainly circulated through capitalist processes generally, right? So um, I don't think we need to start. I guess one another way to articulate what I'm trying to say is that we don't need to start by thinking about um, political economy and culture as ultimately ontologically separate, even if analytically it's
Hmm.
quite useful to do so, right? That the very separation of economy and culture is itself a feature of capitalism, colonialism, and so on, right? Has a history.
I mean, I think part of it is that it can be appealing conceptually to think of them separately, but once you start getting into actual stuff, it gets a lot more complicated. I mean, and this is in fact why music is super interesting because aesthetic labor, musical labor is both part of work, but as you were saying, refusing, fleeing from work. It is both an activity done by people who are, for instance, writing work songs, but also people writing songs trying to imagine, the end of work, the escape from work. It's the different levels are really blurry, or overlapping a lot.
Yeah, and I mean that for me then becomes a tool for thinking about the ways in which the music can become an expression of a particular social context and social antagonisms, right? Um, Not merely because it has a certain level or degree of autonomy, and I think any cultural product does in a sense, necessarily have a degree of autonomy, of aesthetic autonomy from its conditions, because otherwise, why are you going to listen to it? If the music's a perfect reflection of, contemporary capitalism or contemporary sort of um, racial racial inequality or white supremacy, why would you listen to that music, right? I mean, it's just going to effectively reproduce the very conditions in which you're living in. So, I mean, we can talk about the sort of complexities of articulating aesthetic autonomy for kind of mass cultural products. Um, but I guess the point is that the music, therefore, by virtue of emerging out of particular contexts, is necessarily going to mediate those social antagonisms through the labor that it experiences, through the memories of the artists that produce it, through the needs of the audiences that consume it, right? But it doesn't easily simply reflect those conditions. That and that's simply a condition of its own consumption, as I said earlier. If a music simply reflects the the sort of most horrible elements of the world of contemporary capitalist society, then there would be no pleasure in its consumption. So by necessity, it has to open the door for something else, right?
Here I'm thinking about Chuck D's famous quote that Public Enemy is CNN for Black folks. I think it's quite clever. He's talking about the music reflecting a certain sort of reality, a certain experience, and it does, but it doesn't just reflect that. Otherwise, you could just put on, you know, a news report. You know, it's a certain reflection that actually does something with that reality rather than just embodies it.
Yeah, and I mean, you can take something like Public Enemy precisely to articulate all of the complexities involved with that, right? So on the one hand, um, as you say, you have a music which quite consciously takes up a position of mediating, of broadcasting, in effect, the interests of a community that generally are ignored by mainstream media in general, right? Takes it up in a very strange way. It doesn't simply reproduce the values or the forms, conventions of either mainstream pop music or mainstream news broadcasting, right? It offers very contestatory, maybe even revolutionary claims at times, right? Um, and it does so sonically in a intensely dissonant fashion, right? Like from their earliest records, Public Enemy's music is really, really troubling for a conventional European musical ear, right? Um, it's just layers upon layers of dissonant sounds, um, rapid drum breaks, et cetera, et cetera. But we also probably shouldn't let Public Enemy off the hook and romanticize them too much, right? There's a often, I think, for me, quite uneasy, troubling, bootstrapping politics. Um, there's a discourse that sometimes reflects the kind of dominant discourse of the welfare mom,
Mm.
um, especially in that second record. Or maybe was it a discourse that blames drug addiction and effect on drug addicts to Night of the Living Bassheads. I don't know if you remember that song, right? So I mean, it's also not a music that's totally autonomous from its context, right? And that in effect does pick up various kind of discursive strains from the dominant society that it then mirrors back. While at the same time, making really radical, I mean, for me as a child, discovering Public Enemy was really transformative, right?
Well, I mean, you could just say that would be a part of being CNN is also in quite negative ways as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, so I think we could untease what's happening in the late '80s in New York and in America that allows Public Enemy to take up this position and what's happening there. But um, and I guess that that it's all of those threads that I think in a way labor can let us let us untangle, I suppose.
Hmm. or provides a sort of different way into intensity rather than just saying music is just reflecting context. It's intervening in the context in a certain way. And one of the big things your book does is thinking about how it's embodying certain kinds of refusal. Music operates as a certain kind of, let's say, holding area of embodying kinds of social antagonisms, which I think is quite productive, in part because if we were going to reduce doing critical theory to like sports teams, I'd be like, oh, he's drawing from Team Moten. I like Team Moten.
Yeah. So I think actually I'm drawing from if you want to do kind of minor compositions brand about this, I'm definitely drawing from Moten and Harney, who, and Fred Moten and Stefano Harney have been very influential on me. I'm drawing from Angela Metropolis on this, right? I'm drawing obviously from someone who is an important comrade to both of us, George Caffentzis, and his kind of take on the kind of heterodox Italian Marxist tradition of the refusal of labor. And one of the things precisely I'm trying to do in the book, I don't think I succeed, is bring those two traditions to kind of speak to each other. Um, I think there's risks in that, but to uncover in the kind of Black radical tradition on the one hand, and in a kind of ultra leftist tradition, um, I like Caffentzis, but you can find this in kind of French, ultra leftism as well. And Notes Collective have been especially kind of important in bringing that kind of rejection of refusal of labor and kind of rejection of labor as an identity to kind of circulate more widely, the stuff that like Mouvement Communiste and others writing in the 70s. Anyway, but what all of these thinkers share, I think, and articulate, albeit in very divergent ways, is precisely a refusal of work. That is to say, a view not only that capitalist labor in itself is alienating, exploitative, etc., but a rejection of, in effect, starting our struggles from our identity as labor, right? To look for, in a sense, some element that we can hitch on to kind of think about the nature of struggle and the nature of what it is we want and what it is we want to refuse without identifying with with an activity that in effect capitalism compels us to. And the reason simply being is that if we hang on to that identity, we're inevitably going to reproduce some structural elements of capitalist society. So what needs to be refused is labor itself. No nostalgia for labor, no nostalgia for labor organizing, but its refusal and rather the valorization of activities that are not labor, right? And I mean like not labor, like anything not work is good, basically, right? Is one kind of way to think about what I'm trying to say. And I think that that's exactly what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney are articulating. I think it's what someone like Amiri Baraka is articulating at times. I think it's precisely what, I mean, George Caffentzis and the people from whom he draws, Antonio Negri and others, are articulating quite explicitly. And the way I try and draw these traditions together is through music. Not because the kind of ultra leftist tradition has thought very much about music, it hasn't, but by thinking about music partly as a form of labor, I can then start to bring them into dialogue, a kind of awkward dialogue alongside Paul Gilroy, Fred Moten, Stefano Harney, Sylvia Wynter, et cetera, et cetera.
I quite like that sort of nice framing of the various influences you're playing, not just because you mentioned a bunch of friends and comrades, which is always fun, but partially because for years I've kind of said it half seriously, half joking. When people ask about my influences, I'll say, "Oh, it's mainly Brooklyn autonomia." And by Brooklyn autonomia, I mean certain strange autonomism that would have been displaced to New York after the repression in Italy and ended up around Midnight Notes and around people like George and Sylvia, um, and mixed together through autonomedia. So you have a mix of sort of working with radical politics and media and yeah, but also I mean looking at that sort of the valuation of not work as opposed to valorizing an identity is super interesting. I mean, thinking here of let's just take one thing. Let's take wages for housework. Two things. One, a key idea is it's housework, not housewives. It's not falling back into a set identity. And two, if you look at like for years the logo was like a raised fist holding cash. It was very explicitly, almost like celebrating certain kinds of demands for money as particularly as they were a demand for basically not labor.
Yeah. So, and I think that, yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because the history of that movement, nonetheless gets taken up in different ways or I guess the question would be, is there something about the articulation of wages for housework that nonetheless allows itself to somehow be appropriated or picked up as a kind of celebration of housewifery in some more expansive form or some radical form or something like that, right? Um, I guess, a kind of hypostatization of the figure
Well,
of the industrial housewife, right?
to use a quote, since I actually wrote it down here, you have here, you have the line is you talk about refusal that all too easily slips into self-valorization. Refusal that all too easily slips into self-valorization. Instead of negating capital, it just doesn't quite refuse enough.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean that's partly a kind of claim that I'm drawing from another comrade, Marina Vishmit, whose work is also really influential on this book, and who takes a much more critical line vis-a-vis wages for housework, right? And is much more attendant on the negativity, right? Like the act of refusal, but also the kind of element or kernel of negativity that we can find in the refusal to work, which I think George Caffentzis is also deeply attendant to, right? That labor can produce value, as George articulates it, because because it can refuse, right? So that's what, in effect, ontologically, labor is not a machine precisely because it cannot work, and that's the condition for its adding value, right, or producing value. Um, Music is also not work, right? Not essentially, I don't think there's anything essential about music. I'm quite sort of historicist about this. But historically, it is precisely because, as I said earlier, it's been excluded from the wage relation. It's been spat out of the wage relation and has to, I mean, at least, factories are too loud for music. Machines set the tempo of work, so you don't need singing. 19th century bosses in places like England and America were kind of trying to discipline newly industrialized, proletarianized workers. And so prohibitions on singing were really common. It's also the moment, industrialization's the moment where you get a kind of music industry beginning to emerge, whether that's the sale of sheet music, whether that's kind of music halls appearing, people going out to hear music on the weekend. But effectively, music's being spat out of the wage relation and has this liminal position, right? Um, and that is what makes it not work, right? And is in effect part of what it generates the pleasure of music, right? Is because it's not work and it's not simply a representation of work or a kind of mirroring of the activity of work or the experience of work. And in that sense, I think it's quite dangerous for a capitalist society. Like there's something inherently unstable about this ideological product in many instances, perhaps most. Go back to Althusser here, right? But there's something really, really unstable about that relationship, right? Just as there is something unstable about the reproduction of labor, right?
Mhm.
That labor has to reproduce itself outside of the wage relation, outside of the kind of total control of capital, which is both in capital's interest because labor is responsible for that reproduction, but that also is a sort of site of contingency, of possibility, right? Um, so in that sense, I think part of the if there's a kind of theoretical or ontological point to the book, it's also partly that by virtue of being not work, uh, music is a privileged site of instability, a kernel of the desire for non-capitalist life and non-capitalist social relations and so on.
But then what I find really interesting is music as embodying the space of not work, while at the same time historically existing oftentimes as work songs. So you have the the possibility or the desire for not work encoded very much into even the collective obligatory rhythms that structure work itself.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the book is about work songs nominally anyway. And that's partly just because I think that experience and that expression of the refusal of work is so much more powerful, I guess, in the work song, precisely because it's explicit. Or maybe it's just easier to sort of decipher because it's explicit in a work song. Because work songs do a number of things, right? And sort of musicologists and folklorists kind of taxonomize these things in various ways, but it's like, okay, work songs do pace work historically, right? They were used for people chopping down trees or tilling fields or hammering railway tracks in order to pace their activity collectively. But in the process of doing that, it also had other effects. It made time pass differently.
Hmm.
It's a different experience of time than the time of wage labor, which is, I think, for me, the central feature why music is privileged against all other aesthetic or cultural practices, or I would privilege it over other aesthetic cultural practices because it's a play with and a manipulation of time. And it's an experience of time that is not the time of wage labor, right? And that's the kind of central reason why music is privileged. So work songs pace work, work songs give a different experience of time so that time goes by differently, especially when work is especially sort of painful and difficult. They also then intimate an experience of time that is not, as I said, that is not the time of work. So work songs, in a sense, are always also anti-work songs, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't need them. We'd just have a metronome and we could pace work, someone counting to four, right? There's already something in even the slightest little swing, the slightest little groove, um, that in effect is the promise of something else, the promise of a different experience of time.
I suppose you could say work songs mark time, but they also mark the swerve of time.
Yeah. And again, that's dangerous, right? And work songs did other things too. I mean, uh, people would sort of hide anti-boss messages inside of them, right? Expressions of the hatred of work. There were all kinds of sort of levels of communication going on in the history of work songs, and it's obviously a complex history, not a sort of single
Hmm.
um, linear line. I mean, sorry.
I was gonna ask something that goes in a slightly different direction, so I'm not sure if I should do that now or hold on.
Well, I was going to make a bit, so was I. So go ahead. I can come back to this.
So I'm just thinking a bit for a second about John Henry, because of obviously, those songs about hammers. Have you ever read the book John Henry Days by Colson Whitehead?
I have, yeah.
I was just thinking of that because I really like the way he sort of almost like uses John Henry as a sort of like as a laboring figure to counterpose to the I forget the name of the main character who's the journalist who's almost like caught in this interminate, indefinite, immaterial labor that goes on forever and can never find a set work rhythm because it never stops. Um, and I thought that was a different way of exploring almost like cultural form, but using the sort of that idea about the almost like the work rhythm, but in a different way.
Yeah, so if folks haven't read the book, it's a journalist, a group of jobbing journalists, more or less, going to a John Henry festival in a small southern town. Where is it? North Carolina or South Carolina, something like that, Virginia. Um, for a John Henry celebration, this town is making the claim that the kind of mythical figure of John Henry, who is claimed to have died there, or and these guys have this, yeah, interminable, boring time, another hotel, another kind of buffet dinner, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I think, well, there's a number of directions we can take this. We can talk about John Henry, who I find sort of infinitely fascinating. But maybe one thing to note here is something that perhaps people that have been listening to this might be wondering is, of course, the separation of music and labor that I've been talking about that is defines industrialism, defines Fordism, doesn't really exist in the same way today, right? Music is ubiquitous. Um, if you work in any kind of clerical or white collar, so-called white collar labor, then of course you probably have Spotify or something similar on most of the time or all the time. Maybe you control it. Maybe there's a speaker in the office that somebody controls. Um, we listen to music when we're going to and from work. If we work in retail, there's going to inevitably be music played in our workspaces. Whether we have control of it or not makes a huge difference to the quality of our day-to-day experience, right? And indeed, our sort of mental health. Um, the point is that I'm sort of rambling and getting around to is simply that we live in a post-Fordist era where those divisions between work and the time of non-work have become increasingly blurred, both because the kind of activity of work looks more and more like the activities of non-work. Our leisure time is spent on the same machines that our labor time is spent on. Labor is increasingly immaterial, affective, etc., sort of retail and service industry focused. Um, and I think there's something important there about then what happens or what might be happening to the status of music, right? Or what work song might mean. Because in effect, when music potentially accompanies every moment of our lives, which is certainly the desire of the streaming platforms that primarily circulate music today. So when music accompanies every moment of our lives, then the distinction between those two things becomes very, very blurred, or perhaps even non-existent indeed. I should add that unemployment has also risen, right? So even access to work has become less common, work becomes more part-time, more precarious, etc. I think as Marina, I think there's a line I quote in the book from Marina Vishmet, which says something like, that we live in a kind of abject era of neoliberalism. I wish I got the quote right. She's such a good writer. But um, so there's something strange or something tricky happening, and I think there's quite kind of pessimistic conclusions we can draw from this blurring in terms of the kind of role that music might play in terms of being a holder of revolutionary desire and the revolutionary expression or revolutionary activity. Um, which is to say, has it been totally captured by capital? Is it totally indiscernible from wage labor? Or is it the promise now of a world where, can we kind of at our fingertips in a very strange, obverse way, can we almost touch a world which wouldn't be organized around wage labor?
Well, I'll give you a particular kind of silly example. A
Hmm.
number of years ago, at the point where I succeeded in getting a full-time academic job and thus some of going into full-time wage labor or whatever, I found myself listening to a lot more post rock. And looking back, I think part of it is because I almost want something that I could listen to that would be kind of a kind of soundtracky, kind of backgroundy, kind of moving up in terms down in terms of intensity, but didn't have any sort of language in it that would distract me. In other words, I ended up finding myself getting really invested in almost kind of like a post-Fordist version of the work song, one that just kept going on not a set rhythm, but an extensive usage of time where
Mm.
you're marked your 70th essay in a row, right? And you just need something that sounds vaguely kind of epic background to keep you going.
Um, I also had a big post-rock phase, and in fact, you know, I write in the book about ambient music, and I think both of them operate not that different from Muzak in some ways, right?
Mm.
So Muzak was initially designed not for retail spaces, not to encourage consumption or make kind of zones of consumption more comfortable. It was designed for factories, and it was designed to manage worker productivity. And the promises that Muzak's owners made to factory owners was that they increased product, you know, they even had data. It was like they increased productivity 37% or something. And the way that they did it is you had music, usually, you know, variations on popular ballads or popular songs, but smoothed out. And it worked on a cycle similar to what you're describing with the post rock song, right? The kind of slow build. And Muzak's songs actually worked on a 15-minute cycle. And it was about managing the workers so you could sort of enthuse them and fill them with energy, but not so much that they would be diverted from the task at hand. And so it was a very careful calculation that the
Okay.
Muzak Corporation purported to do.
I now want to start a very amazing Muzak post rock band called Godspeed You Post Fortis Worker.
Well, but here's the question, right? I mean, I said I write about ambient. What is it? What's the difference between a post-pop record, or I write about like these Japanese ambient mu albums from the 80s that are being reissued, or a Brian Eno album? What's different from that album and the most bland corporate elevator music? Because
Or
there
what's
is a difference, right?
or what's different to hip hop beats to study and chill to?
Yeah, exactly, right? But um, there's something about those musics that no matter how atmospheric, no matter how much they simply, you know, just fill a room and don't disturb, and which is partly why I love them. I listen to a lot of that stuff, but um, it's partly why I wrote about them. There is a dissonance in them, right? There is something you can find, something in their texture, right? That doesn't simply fit perfectly with the demands of the society, sonic or otherwise, right? In a way that there is with music, or in a way that there is with the blandest elevator music. Or I don't know if you've seen this one, but someone found you can find it on archive.org. I think someone they uploaded it there. But someone got all of the tapes of Kmart. If people don't know Kmart, it was a large department store in North America, which shut, I think, in the early 90s, went out of business. And they found all of the tapes from like 1986 to 91 or whatever, 90, whatever it is, of the music they played in Kmart, right? Which is really amazing. But there's something different between that music and even the perhaps, you know, quite soothing atmospheric sound of a minimal ambient record made by a sound designer in Japan in the 1980s.
Probably is an interesting thing to do there with like almost like corporate radio stations. I'm thinking here of I lived on the block from of one of the East Anglia co-ops, and when I've been there before, I've heard like you're listening to co-op radio. So they have their own radio station where okay, it's probably not actually a radio station. It's probably like basically a digital stream, right?
Hmm.
So even a ostensibly quasi worker owned place is thinking through of like how to sort of standardize a kind of like sonic experience of like going to like the corner shop.
Or indeed in this country, in the UK, hospitals would have their, excuse me, own radio stations. The Thamesmead Estate in East London, which at its peak in the what, late 70s, maybe later, early mid 80s, housed 40,000 people or something like that, had its own closed circuit radio station that broadcast directly into every flat, right? And I think that was actually resident run, but I'd be interesting to see how the hospitals, for instance, tried to manage and kind of organize the moods and the psychic states of patients and doctors and nurses, orderlies, and so on. And what the, I mean, maybe there's some industrial relations scholar who's done this, right? I haven't come across it, but but there is something different when those musics potentially accompany every moment now, and where the management of those sonic moods are totally individualized in a way, right? Where we have to manage those moods like, is it time for workout music? Is it time for, yeah, marking essays music? Is it time for cleaning and so on, right? That's all being individualized and devolved, just as, the management of risk, financial, etc., has all been individualized. I mean, it's a deeply kind of neoliberal characteristic. And the other thing that, I mean, is perhaps less intensely neoliberal, but more in keeping with the spirit of capitalism and all of this, and the spirit of colonialism, indeed, is the fact that this is also a project of individualizing and managing the sonic environment, right? We walk around with headphones and kind of project our own individualized sonic environments onto these deeply polyvalent sound of the world, right? And even listening to like field recordings so that, on our headphones while we walk around a city, ignoring its own soundscape, right?
Now I'm sort of imagining sort of like field recordings and experimentation to have a mental episode too, or
Yeah.
one thing I find interesting is almost how the kind of like that structuring, that programming, that sort of a logarithmic sort of like structuring of music, then we'll throw out something which would be quite random, like your example of the Midori Takata piece, which also all of a sudden becomes wildly popular out of nowhere. You're like, how does that happen?
I don't know. So Midori Takata makes this album in 1981 or 82, I think. It sells a couple hundred copies. It's released on a small sound design label. And then suddenly in when 2013, when YouTube introduces its autoplay function so that, playlists just play on indefinitely, um, it suddenly becomes recommended to people listening to Brian Eno and I think some post-rock albums, incidentally, and becomes a minor hit and certainly a big hit by the standards of like independent music, right? She's playing massive sold out halls, 30 some odd years after the album's first release. I talked to people at YouTube kind of off the record. I should stop saying this on public talks, but it was off the record who said they have no idea how. But I suppose there is always something in these dead worlds, right? In these automated worlds that's not simply all automation. Again, I think capital has a problem with something like music or culture more broadly, right? Because it would love to organize all of this stuff along purely capitalist lines. Obviously, the automation of content, video, audio, text that AI represents is the latest phase in that. But it can't automate it all because it also needs a level of individuality so that it simply reflect the world out of which it's produced, because then no one will listen to it, right? And no one will want it. It has to have an outside, as it were, to use a kind of spatial metaphor.
So two things. One, the more silly point is the first time that I heard that Midori Takata record was actually in Singapore in 2019. There was a large exhibition on at the well, actually across several art galleries at the Singapore Science Museum about minimalism, and there was a room entirely devoted to listening to that album.
Wow.
So how it's interesting how it went from sort of a relatively low scale release that was kind of forgotten to then being having an art museum devoting an entire room to it by 2019. Um, and more substantial point, it's almost kind of like you were saying about not just reflecting the circumstances. I mean, to put it in sort of like autonomous upper East Coast terms, certain kinds of
Mm.
refusal work are almost what capital has to move and adapt to find its future. And almost it kind of capitalism needs the creativity of its negation in order to find a direction. So if it was just reflection, it'd be like there'd be nothing there. It's almost like, come on, you gotta be angry with me. You gotta be pissed off and give me new ideas.
Yeah, capital can't create, right?
Hmm.
Capital can't create. It will always, and I think AI is going to show this. I mean, at most, it can sort of appropriate past creations, right? I mean, in that sense, AI is no different than any other form of subsumption of, in this case, creative or intellectual or whatever activity. Um, yeah, and so it's always necessarily going to be on the back foot, and it's always going to necessarily be trying to manage that relationship, right? Of both needing labor, but not being able to, but also needing not labor as the source of its value, right? Or the ability to capacity to refuse, as I put it earlier, as
Hmm.
George Caffentzis puts it. It will always need, in a sense, and that will always be a source of its instability. Absolutely, right? And so music's always for me going to be a privileged signifier. And in some contexts, I mean, partly because unlike other forms, um, levels of music education can circulate quite easily. You don't need high levels of technology, for instance, to pass on basic musical education. Unlike, say, I don't know, the history of theater or something like that, right? Um, and because of its kind of everyday nature, I think it will always be a privileged, necessarily be a privileged site of that refusal.
One of the things you get into that I find quite interesting in part, because this is a area of music that I know less about, is because you're talking about music as both embodying a kind of, or bearing traces of a work discipline, but also its escape. And then you get into talking about the rise of trap
Mm.
as embodying a certain kind of, let's say, spatialization of the city, the contradictions of post-Fordist labor, the rise of sort of like wageless labor as the sort of as a more dominant form. All these contradictions get wrapped up into a sort of like rise of a new aesthetic form.
Yeah, and I think in that chapter, um, on trap rap is really the one where I do the best job or do the most work in terms of the thing that I was talking about earlier, in terms of thinking about the relationship of political economy and cultural form and trying to untangle as many of the threads that relate the cultural activity and the musical object to its context. Um, and trap rap is interesting to me partly because I listened to a lot of it, or I did at the time, and I got quite obsessed with Gucci Man, who's one of the artists that I write about quite a bit. Um, I mean, this is around 2005, 2006, 7, 8, 9. And Atlanta hip hop more broadly and Southern hip hop more broadly, Memphis, Houston, and so on. Um, but trap is also interesting because it is explicitly a form of work song, right? This is music that historically, at least, it's kind of once it becomes mass popularized, themes get more diverse. But initially, it's historically where it emerges is music about living and surviving as a drug dealer. Um, it is also unique because the way the music circulates outside of major labels, is, again, up to its popularization around 2013 to 2017. But initially, artists are distributing their music mainly through independent labels, mainly through labels that are funded themselves in part by the drug trade. The artists involved are themselves sort of have one foot in and out of those illicit economies and therefore are often in danger, live quite violent lives, are in and out of prison, for instance, in many cases, as Young Jeezy and Gucci Mane, the two artists that I kind of focus on, are. through much of the first parts of their career until they sort of get professionalized to a degree where they're sort of further away from their lives as a drug dealer, debts that they might have to other drug dealers, and so on. So it's music about work, and it's music that doesn't celebrate work, right? It's work songs. It's about the day-to-day quotidian sort of activity of what it is like, and it's obviously an aestheticized version. It's not meant to be documentary, right? Um, no matter what the kind of history you talked about, Black CNN, the history of hip hop was often taken as a documentary form, and at times it made that claim. But this certainly isn't documentary. But it is an aestheticization of a particular type of work to which uh, Black people in particular are overrepresented because of limited access to conventional labor markets, right? I'm sure I don't need to explain the sort of economics of drug dealing to your audience, but um, so it's music about work that doesn't celebrate that work. It has a lot of the traditions of Black oral cultures, of braggadocio, of bad man stories and so on. But it's also very affectively sort of exasperated, right? It's music without much hope. The only hope is that, um, I mean, that you can, the American dream that you become such a great drug dealer that you don't have to be a drug dealer anymore. But there's also elements, like especially in Young Jeezy, where it's clear that the artist doesn't even believe in the kind of aspirational thing that he's kind of peddling to his audience, right? Um, Gucci Man is even less hopeful. It's more a kind of playful aestheticization of the drudgery of the day-to-day activity that he's involved in. It's existentially anxious music, right? Quite terrifying in many respects.
I mean, the music that I was most listening out coming out of this, which doesn't come out directly, is by people like Zilla Kami and City Morgue, who are just completely kind of existentially dreadful about everything. Um,
So I think that kind of element probably also comes out of the music that prefigures trap music, which I talk about briefly, but is really like music coming out of Memphis in the early 1990s, and you get this in Houston as well around that time, where you get a kind of horror rap that happens where artists are really obsessed with horror films. They write a sort of slasher flick songs, right? Whether they're the main character or whether they're a victim, changes song to song, right? But it's really people sort of, playing on popular horror film and using, and sonically, it's very sort of, I mean, they use samples and they use the types of keyboards that were being used on things like Friday the 13th and Halloween. It's very eerie. It's um it's a very sort of like existentially, I mean, I said anguish before, I think, but dreadful music, right? There's a kind of it's permeated, it's dripping with dread and fear and angst, right? Um, and then aestheticized into this like incredible form. And when you and I were talking about trap drums before we started, and the kind of drums that trap rap is associated with that have now become, used by every kind of big pop diva, pop singer and boy band imaginable, including what I find quite interesting is like boy bands in Korea and Japan and the way this stuff circulates, um, actually comes from this kind of horror rap from Memphis and Houston
hmm.
and environs in the early 1990s, right? And those kind of rhythms and the triplet flows that the MCs are using come from that moment as well. And in many respects, trap rap is taking on those horror rap elements and projecting them onto the experience of survival in 21st century urban America.
Well, that's what I find kind of interesting about it. You listen to, like, for instance, again, it's like City Morgue, like they're not going to be in a nice, easy soundtrack to your labor process. Just the almost like the mixing of it is deliberately abrasive. It's almost like trying to interrupt any rhythm.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Uh, I mean, there's on the one hand, later in trap, there's an aspiration for sort of popular fame. Maybe there is early on, but mostly the music. I think the artists are cognizant that the music's going to circulate primarily locally in Atlanta, Houston, New Orleans, colleges, universities, that kind of thing, and then obviously clubs and strip clubs in particular. I think the other thing to say about that kind of ambiguity that you're talking about is with a lot of the artists I'm talking about, right? Um, you would not think of them as progressive artists, right? I mean, there's a real profound moral ambiguity to what they write about, what they do, and I sort of go through, the various literatures, hip hop studies, black studies, cultural studies that have really sort of gone back and forth and really oscillated around what do we do with this, right? It can't simply be celebrated because it can be quite noxious at times. Um, it's not simply a documentary form, and you can't. I mean, I would reject the readings still, which still exist, which would simply pathologize it, right? There are nonetheless, I think, deeply emancipatory and revolutionary desires that it expresses in various ways, sometimes explicitly, often implicitly. The gender politics are also quite complex, and the relationship to the economy of the strip club and of sex work in particular, where the music circulates, I think has really um, been a point of tension amongst feminist scholars, especially in the US in that period when the music was especially popular, although it's ongoing, but from around the 2010s, and how we think about gender, how we think about expressions of pleasure in the body, how we think about the way that then circulates when it's taken up by the dominant society and becomes kind of top 40 hits, right? Because the meanings then change again. Um, so I guess the point is simply that it's just like dripping with ambiguity and dripping with complexity that I make no claim to resolve, but rather to, yeah, try and inhabit the contradictions in all of those things, which are themselves reflections in many ways of contradictions of the society more broadly, right?
No, no, no. And I think that's what you do really good in the chapter and across the whole book is try to stay, I guess, with the complexities and the kind of contradictions. And sometimes, I mean, what I tend to do is I want to go find something that's almost a bit too easy. Like I would be like, subprime crisis, therefore chopped and screwed. Sounds very clever. But it's like, no, it's not that clever. It's not that easy. It's always more than that. So it's always excessive to that.
Yeah, so the link to the subprime crisis is quite simply that in 2005, the subprime crisis has already hit Atlanta, and it's hit in particular the neighborhoods where the artists I'm writing about are living or grow up in. Atlanta is one of the sort of ground zeros of the subprime crisis, along with Florida, a few other places. And there is a kind of emancipatory line that I think you can take and that I draw from Fred Moten and others, right? Around seeing subprime as a sort of refusal. But the way that gets expressed in trap and in the culture more broadly, I think becomes a bit more complicated, right? Because there is often so the link is on the one hand that these people are dealing drugs often out of the trap, which is an abandoned house, which will tend to be a house that's been abandoned because people weren't making their mortgage payments, right? Um, so it's not the only reason, but that would be a main one. So there's an element in which the music and the culture, the sort of ways in which people are reproducing themselves, out of which it emerges, is intensely tied to the subprime crisis. But at the same time, there's also a deeply, an identification with the commodity form in itself that runs through the music, right? So you can't quite simply say, I think, um, this is music that expresses, the kind of act of maroonage that Fred Moten and others are sort of talking about, right? That it's not simply that, but then on the other hand, is what does the aestheticization of wealth do here. Because again, that's not simply a simple, money's great. I love money. Look at the way throw it around, right? There's a more ambiguous relationship to the commodity form and the identification with the commodity form as well. Um, which I could talk about for days because I've been thinking about that a lot recently, right? Where the abstraction of exchange value, right, is made sensuous in a sense. It's not a reversal of exchange into use value, as some people have suggested, of in effect making gold or money beautiful again, or useful in that sense. But it does problematize and it does sort of allow the emblems of capital to circulate in a different, quite ambiguous way. I'm still not quite totally sure what to do with.
Mm. No, what I like there is it's again, it's not simply a celebratory thing or a horrible thing. It's just this really complicated, messy combination, and and that's what I think your book is really good at, is trying to almost like, explore some of that. I mean, to take it in a strange direction. Okay, you know, okay, before anything, I'll have to say I like Sublime Frequencies and I like Alan Bishop. I like them a lot. But you have this quote here where Alan Bishop is talking about how almost his aesthetic appreciation of music that he's finding all around the world is made better by not knowing the context and not knowing about it. And I just look at it and go, what? No. I think almost getting almost understanding a bit more, not saying you have to be like a music historian to appreciate a song, but knowing a bit more about that context actually, I think gives it at least helps me to get things that I would have understood otherwise.
Yeah, so I also love Sublime Frequencies, right? And part of what I mean, I'm quite like critical because I can't help it because I've been in a university for too long. In throughout the book, but it's a kind of book that's like my problematic faves, right? And trying to sort of deal with all of them. Um, and Sublime Frequencies were really formative for me when those early compilations started coming out, I guess like 20 years ago now or so, maybe a bit even more than 20 years ago. They totally blew me away. I mean, it was like a paradigm shift for me in terms of thinking about music and what kind of music. The one that was really, and I still listen to all the time, is the Cambodian Cassettes Archive, which I
Mm,
think is still one of the best things they ever put out. Um, but so Sublime Frequencies, if people aren't familiar with them, are a label out of the North Pacific Northwest of the US who have been traveling across Southeast Asia, North and Central Africa for a long time and collecting recordings around, I mean, they've been all over, haven't they? Syria, Iraq, etc. Um, Collecting music that they're finding in local markets and things like that. Also doing field recordings of artists and releasing some of those field recordings, even recording radio in places like Laos and then or Niger, and then just messing around with the radio dial for an hour and then putting that out as an album. Obviously, it's much more edited than that, and there's a real artfulness to what they do. I don't mean to disparage it but it is problematic because part of what the attraction of what sublime frequencies do is premised on is generating as big of a gap with dominant Western culture as possible, right? That's part of the pleasure. And I mean that line that you quoted, they're explicit about it. We want to generate because that gap doesn't exist in the way that we want to imagine that it might. So we need to generate it somehow so that we can get the pleasure of that distance of consuming something exotic, something other back, as it were, right? And even, I mean, also that gap's obviously also changed from the period when they first started, where I think a lot of that stuff was a lot harder to get hold of than it might be today, where everyone's uploading everything right away. But I also think, I mean, to be a bit more critical of them, there is an element to which they always define themselves against academic ethnomusicology, right? And they kind of describe what they're doing as a kind of punk ethnomusicology. But I think that that's probably a quite outdated view of what ethnomusicologists do because they've adopted a kind of quite deep cultural reflexivity, generally is, definitive of the discipline for quite a long time. Whether that doesn't mean that ethnomusicology nevertheless is neo-colonial in a new fashion than it would have been in the 50s or 60s is up for discussion, because I think it probably is, right? In different ways, it's still a discipline dominated, like every discipline is dominated by a handful of Western universities, um, people getting big grants and then going to, say, I don't know, somewhere in Africa or Asia or South America, collecting a bunch of music and then presenting it at conferences at Harvard and UCL or whatever and getting paid a huge amount of money in order to do so, right? So, of course, it's still a neo-colonial project, but it's definitely more reflexive about its subject position than I think the Sublime Frequencies guys would allow. Um,
One of the projects they did, which I liked, but both was a little bit annoyed at, is they did a record by with Senyawa,
mhm.
Indonesia, who I really love. And one of the things is that I went on and sort of did a project of collecting their lyrics and translating them, not because so for if people don't know Senyawa, they're a, how would we describe it? Somewhere between being sort of like a doom metal band using sort of like homemade instruments with vocals that range between shrieks and random sort of like singing, but they're coming out of Indonesia, so that they're singing in various local dialects. And I was thought we were listening to sort of put out a sort of a booklet of the lyrics because I had no idea what they're on about. Um, so not to try to like, the idea that you should sit and listen to each song knowing, okay, this is about this, but almost getting a more sense of like, where are these guys coming from? What are they really on about? Rather than just hearing it as sort of like a incomprehensible otherness. It's like, no, actually, they've got a point. Um, um,
Yeah, I mean, I guess another way to, I mean, the solution wouldn't be knowing more, right? That in itself, and like
hmm.
developing an encyclopedic knowledge of, say, um, Cambodian and Isan, like folk music from Northeast Thailand or whatever, in itself isn't going to resolve the problem here, because the problem is ultimately one of capitalism and neocolonialism, right? There's a structural inequality that conditions the way in which that music is going to be consumed that isn't going to change until we eradicate and overcome capitalism,
Well,
right?
this can be our key takeaway. Better mixed tapes will not solve capitalism.
Yeah. But on the other hand, I mean, I guess, but I don't know if Sublime Frequencies are are explicit and aware of that, right? So I guess, I mean, maybe I'm disciplining them now and saying, well, you should be explicit about the limits of your own discursive, like articulation or something. But I don't want to do that. But there is something that I've found disturbing when that kind of music, this kind of like, um, third world pop music or whatever started to become more popularized and became a kind of industry unto itself in the years that followed, again in the 2010s, in particular, that I found really disturbing, but also reflective of a new phase in the nature of globalization and colonialism and so on, right?
There was one time I interviewed Rolly from Sinyawa weirdly for Maximum Rock and Roll, and we were talking about sort of what their plans were. And one of the things they said was we got offered to do an album with Sub Pop, but we said no because we don't want to get too big too fast because they won't be treated as like a third world novelty act, and people will like us for 2 seconds and then forget us. And so their thing was they wanted to almost like develop a sort of a broader sort of like appreciation of what they were doing as a context and as a part of a range of sounds rather than just here's, oh, look at these wacky guys from Indonesia. Look, what are they doing?
And they're right. So I know this from talking to people at labels and reissue labels and so on. Like the first Omar Suleiman album sold massively, and then it's sort of less and less and less into nothing, right? So you have your one Syrian, like Eastern Syrian wedding singer, Chubi Chubi thing, and then you're done. And then you have one Isan record, right? Molam record from Thailand. Okay, you're done. And right, it becomes this kind of collection, not of artists, but of genres, and not of genres, but ultimately, it operates under the logic of tourism, or it
Hmm.
operates, under the same logic of tourism that defines the way people tend to consume food in big metropolitan cities, right? You have this kind of, street food from X today, Cambodian street food, then Syrian street food and whatever. And you sort of march your way around the world in cosmopolitan fashion, right? As it were. Uh, what's interesting is Senyawa come a bit later, right? I didn't write about this, but I've thought about it a lot. Is Senyawa come a bit later, and there's labels like Nyege Nyege, which is an African dance music label, although owned and run by I think some Belgian, like white Belgian guys. So I'm not quite sure. I don't know much about the label, but I've wanted to sort of have an opportunity to think more. But there is a different phase where um, platforms like Boiler Room are increasingly broadcasting from, say India or Vietnam, where the noise scene in Indonesia or electronic experimental scene in Vietnam is increasingly sort of growing and getting a bit of global exposure, right, on to some degree on its own terms, which is very different than even what was happening, in the 10 years ago or something like that, right? 15 years ago, where people have a lot more control over their material and how it's consumed and how it's presented, I think, and a new kind of economy, and presumably, therefore, also a new logic of exoticism that is emerging to frame it as well, right?
Yeah, I quite like Nyege. I actually sent them a box of books a few years ago, so they should have copies of the Undercommons.
Amazing. Yeah. So, I mean, they'd be a really interesting case study, right? The festival, they have a festival every year. I can't remember where it is.
Is it in Uganda?
I
In
think
Kampala?
so. Yeah, I think so. Right, but so by what logic? Because it's very, very rare that music from the third world, global south, whatever, circulates in um, the West or in the global North, right? Indeed, it's very rare that music from Southern Europe or Central or Eastern Europe circulates in the West, right? I mean, the
Well,
UK and the
I suppose
US.
the old equivalent of getting on the sort of like radio regular play would now be something like getting on the front page of Bandcamp. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Or getting on the right playlist on NTS or on Spotify or whatever. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and it's really hard because nobody collects data about the independent music industry on a wide level, right? So, um, because there's not much, I mean, there's no stakes in it really for outside of, quite small labels. So I don't know what those economics look like and what the kind of global circulation of those cultural objects looks like exactly. I think it'd be hard to, I mean, you could probably figure it out, but,
but back to Senora for a second. That's what I think is quite interesting. A few years ago, when they did that project where they tried to have 44 different labels they work with at the same time, trying to release their music, is they're almost trying to come up with a form of circulation and the labor of circulation that was almost more to what they were trying to do rather than just being controlled by a system of distribution which they basically were just a bit part in.
hmm. I- did well, did it work?
I think it worked adequately well.
Yeah.
I guess it depends what your version of meaning of success is, but I think it worked pretty well.
Yeah. And they're quite unique, right? As a artist from Indonesia, able to, I presume, more or less like at least have tours that presumably generate some income and can tour the West, every few years. I mean, there aren't many, right?
Hmm. They also occupy the weird space of being an Indonesian artist whose music then got used in Red Dead Redemption 2 to a sort of cowboy Western video game, which is completely sort of like, anyways, yeah. Um, but we should probably start nudging not towards an end, but towards a pause. So maybe as a sort of like a sort of, I'll give you a sort of like a very generic kind of like question. It's sort of like, so where now? What's next? What you doing?
Is that okay? That's it. Now that I've offended the whole kind of post-world music economy, I
Yeah,
can
so
just
we
like
successfully
le
offended Alpha fans, Sublime
yeah,
Seas fans. Um, who else did we manage to offend? We
maybe Nyege Nyege.
got dangerously close to offending Public Enemy fans.
Yeah, yeah. Although that one I'll stand behind the hardest. I love Public Enemy. They were formative for me, but some of those lyrics are horrifying. Um, what next? I am writing about Sean Puffy Combs
Ah.
and Bad Boy. I mean, I've been interested in the moment in the late 1990s when because that's the
Hold
moment.
on, the moment when every music video seemed like it was filmed inside a cheese grater.
Yes, exactly. And I write about the videos quite a bit because it's a unique moment that emerges. I mean, I won't bore you with I could bore you with the details of where that form comes from, but it comes from early to mid 90s R&B video. But it changes slightly when it moves to hip hop. It's also the moment that Black popular music comes to dominate the pop charts for the first time, both in the US and across Europe. And it's really the moment where hip hop becomes the global popular music, right? So by from 97, hip hop starts to have a kind of dominant, permanent place in the pop charts at number one in the charts with the three Bad Boy albums, one from Biggie, one from Puffy, and one from Mace, and basically never leaves the top of the charts thereafter. And 20 years later, it becomes the most consumed music in America, if not the world.
I could almost imagine this being like a Rick Beato video where he's talking about where everything goes wrong with rock
Yeah.
bands.
Yeah, there's a bit of that. There's a definitely an inclination to do that, but there's also, and it's been very hard to talk about this music given revelations of human trafficking, sexual violence, etc., that are still emerging about Puff Daddy. But there's also aesthetically something quite interesting in that cheese grater, effect that you described, which is a particular aestheticization of capital
Hmm.
that is the condition for the circulation of Black popular music on a global scale, and which is quite ambiguous, which I've got quite obsessed with over the last year or two.
Well, that sounds like it should be interesting. And if the revelations of Diddy's misdeeds keep giving more and more, it would be unfortunately timely in all the wrong ways.
Yeah, it's been awkward. It's been difficult to deal with and to sort of talk about someone as an artist when they're also a incredibly violent, monstrous person. But I also think that's partly just reflective of the patriarchy that's at the core of creative industries and of capitalism more broadly, right?
But better mixtapes are not going to solve capitalism.
Exactly. Yeah, there's the conclusion. Yeah.
Cool, cool. Well, thank you very much for coming along, and I will make sure to put a link to both to get your book and to the excellent mix you did in the show notes. So
Thank you. The book is on the verge of going open access like any week now, so maybe people should just hold off and wait a week or two and they can get a free PDF.
excellent, cool. Okay,